I'm Sheila Bond, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the last panel of our conference. This session is Marking Identity, and our first speaker is David Spafford, who comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania. David will be talking about family crests and family identity in warrior Japan. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. Hopefully I won't be too discombobulated or too chaotic. I've been figuring out how I wanted to do this all day, and we'll see if I actually did figure it out. Can you hear me? I move a fair amount when I talk, and so I can see myself moving away from the microphone and everything. I'm fairly loud. Can you hear me well enough if I sort of stray a little bit? Okay. So, my subject today is mon or kamon, which is sort of the Japanese heraldic equivalent of of coats of arms. In the case of Japan, for some reason, we always call them crests or family crests. They're not technically crests. When I started reading, crests are actually usually three-dimensional things on top of helms, but which is not what they were in Japan by any means. But anyway, so I'm going to call them crests, and I hope you're not sort of heraldry purists. And if you are, please really just be patient with me here today. I'm a sort of neophyte in this whole family crest thing. The family crests are still, in many ways, very present in Japanese culture. And I put these up because I'm pretty sure that you're familiar with at least one of them. You may drive one of them, for all I know. And the others are also very visible in Japan in daily life. And family crests pretty much segue directly into logos of companies in many, many cases. And in some cases, this is simply because a company that had a family crest before the 19th century is still in existence and kept on using its logo. And so just to show you very quickly how some of these work, one thing that's obviously interesting about family crests, to my mind, again, as a neophyte in all of this, is the fact that they're operating within a language that uses Chinese characters. And so there's aspects of Chinese characters, there's sort of pictorial aspects of Chinese characters that sort of make the leap to a crest, an iconic crest, not too great. And yet at the same time, there's all kinds of opportunities for play that are available. The first one, Mitsukoshi, is a department store. I'm not sure if there are any in America. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. In this case, their crest is just a circle with the second of the two characters in the name Mitsukoshi at the center, the character for Koshi. The other ones all adopt different strategies. Mitsubishi is a bit of a rebus. The name Mitsubishi means 3 water chestnuts. And water chestnut is almost also a homophone for rhombus. So there you go. Mitsubishi is 3 water chestnuts, and that's right in front of you. Mitsui, which is the middle one here, takes a hybrid approach. The name Mitsui, and by the way, Japanese surnames are all very descriptive and usually descriptive of the landscape. From most of my Chinese friends and acquaintances are always very amused by Japanese surnames because they're sort of tall mountain, middle village, blue hill, and so on and so forth. They're all very, very descriptive. So Mitsui means 3 wells. The 3, I think we know from yesterday. We can all read now, thanks to Steve's talk. The enclosure is a well tipped at a 45-degree angle and stretched open a little bit. So Mitsui, quite literally, is both a drawing and the spelling of their name. The fourth one here is Sumitomo, and also another large trading house, now actually fused with Mitsui in a massive banking conglomerate. This also looks to have been based on the idea of the well, but Sumitomo just so happens to have been the crest of the Sumitomo house in the Edo period, in the early modern period. So when they survived into the late 19th and early 20th century modernization of the country, they just kept their crest. Their crest became a logo. So as I mentioned, heraldry is, and I mentioned that kind of as an introductory set of remarks, heraldry remains very present in everyday Japan, but my interest today, in keeping very much with the general emphasis in this conference at Brown, is on pre-modern heraldry. And I'm going to define pre-modern somewhat idiosyncratically today. I basically mean everything between the 8th and the 19th century. My main focus, though, will be on the centuries between the 12th and the 17th. So most of what I'll say, unless I say otherwise, will be about that period. And I'm also not, somewhat at odds perhaps with some of the approaches we've seen today, I'm not going to really delve into the formal aspects of Mon too much, and I'm not going to really look much at sort of how Mon signify. What I'm interested in primarily is what work Mon do in terms of the social work that they do for the people who adopt the Mon, and in terms of the sort of the ways in which they help create identity for those who employ them. Here are the Mon of some of the most sort of famed Japanese warrior houses of the Civil War. The Ashikaga were the ruler, the second shogunal family. The Tokugawa were the third and most powerful of all of the shogunal families. You'll have no trouble finding these sorts of things on the internet. Almost all of my sources, at first I'd scanned books very dutifully. Then I thought, just let me Google them, and they just come up. Just an explosion all over the internet of this stuff. So let me just say a word or two about Mon as I am interested in looking at them, and then I would like to give basically a brief survey of what we do know about Mon and the history of Mon, or Kamon, as it is generally recounted in the few texts, the few serious texts. There are many texts that are just not very scholarly, but in the few scholarly texts there are. And finally, I would like to use the end of my time, if I haven't sort of hopelessly run over already, to give you some thoughts about what I feel is interesting and potentially overlooked about Mon at this point. Way back in 1971, and honestly this may be the last serious academic piece on Kamon and Mon in English, John Dower noted, by their very nature, the heraldic designs of Japan were simultaneously intensely intimate items and products of broad cultural, social, and economic forces. As such, they offer a small link between the personal and the impersonal, and illuminate aspects of Japanese experience often obscured in the historian's overview. This assessment resonates with Mark Cruz's more recent observation in the context of Europe, that the study of heraldic practice takes us to the heart of medieval symbology and is an important domain for exploring attitudes and beliefs about language, history, performance, devotion, and politics. And all of this is great, and it's wonderful that John Dower said this as early as 1971. He himself, in the book he then produced on Mon, didn't actually follow through with any of the promise of the Mon, and nobody really has in Japan. And one of the really somewhat interesting things about studying Mon, or trying to study Mon as I'm doing now, is to be confronted with the absolute dearth of critical and historicizing work on the subject. My main focus is not on crests overall, and it won't be on crests overall today, but it's on crests as signifiers of familial affiliation. My larger project, within which Mon actually fit quite nicely, is a monographic project entitled The Corporate Warrior House in Japan, 1450-1650. So since I'm really interested in Mon as instruments of the corporate house, let me talk for a moment about the corporate house to give you an idea of the general context within which Mon operate. These houses, and by the way, I'm going to leave this slide up for a moment. House is the first of the two characters for those of you who don't know. In Japanese, it's pronounced ie when read alone. When read in a compound like this, it's read ka, or it can be read ke as well, but in this case, it's read ka. So kamon there, and the first of the two characters is ie. It means the house. These houses are known in Japan as ie, and are often regarded as pre-modern society's fundamental units of kinship, as patriarchal stem families made up of a lord, his son and heir, and his parents. I have argued that elsewhere that the ie are better understood as corporate units made up of kin and non-kin members, and structured around the core of a lineage. Understood as a lineage, the contour of a house's membership become less clear-cut, with more or less elective constituencies. There's a fine succession, there's a line, excuse me, of successors descended from the founder, and this is a patriline, although it is not one characterized by very strong primogeniture, as well as varying numbers of non-inheriting kin. These non-inheriting kin tended to grow in numbers over the course of the generations, as you may well imagine, until they were shed, not physically, just sort of, as an agreement, they were shed and allowed or compelled to found separate houses for themselves. These new houses, while patrimonially distinct, typically remained linked to the main house through intermarriage or various looser forms of political affiliation. On the other hand, non-kin affiliates, whom we call often housemen, which is also a direct translation of the Japanese, tended to grow more attached to a house as generations went by. Rhetorically, longer service was understood to denote deeper loyalty. More concretely, long-term service was a visible sign of ongoing and deep investment in a house's prosperity and was rewarded accordingly. Housemen often held important offices in a house's administration. They commanded armies in war, and when sufficiently loyal, which in practical terms generally meant that they were loyal for a long enough time, they could become house elders and play a key role in a house's policy making. Most crucially, they served as arbiters during successions. Successions were times of great peril for even the most prosperous houses, since there were no unequivocal rules for the selection of an heir. And if a house head died before his chosen successor was old enough to fend for himself, it was common for siblings and sometimes uncles to mount challenges. Housemen served as mediators and sometimes as instigators, needless to say. Often they were interested mediators, for many of them intermarried with the core kinship group. In terms of the composition of the house, of course, these intermarriages were significant as they heightened the integration of non-kin and ultimately blurred the lines between the insider kin group and the outsider housemen. Now, there's a rich body of scholarship on the structural characteristics of the word house, and what I'm really interested in exploring when talking about the house is really the house as the central sort of social nexus of, the social nexus of sociability and of access to wealth and power. In other words, actors in medieval Japan and pre-modern Japan were primarily interfacing with society at large through the channel of the house, through the framework of the house. There was no such thing as sort of individual operating for himself and out for himself. In this regard, I find the evolution of kamon or of mon. So I'm going to call them kamon for the most part. Steve introduced them as mon. Mon means pattern. And it is true that mon as pattern can refer to these, but kamon is very specifically, in general parlance, the word used, or shomon, used for these sort of heraldic devices. A pattern otherwise can also just refer to to a pattern on a piece of cloth. In this regard, the evolution of kamon is a useful way of looking at the shape and prominence of familial and quasi-familial bonds. Now, as I said, there is a fairly widely accepted history of the evolution of these crests in Japan, and I'll recite it in a moment. First, just let me give you three sort of provisos about sort of what this history, sort of what's going on behind the scenes with this history. The first is that there is a considerable literature in Japanese and a tiny literature in English, which doesn't mean it's not accessible, but it says something about what that literature is designed to do. And indeed, the second point here is that most of these books are books written very seriously and published very seriously and expensively, but for aficionados of heraldry, for the most part. Japanese aficionados of heraldry, typically people interested in finding out about their own heritage, or more often finding out about potential crests associated with their surname. Maybe finding out what their crest is like. So these books are, for the most part, catalogs. They list just in some cases thousands. There's one collection that includes over 6,000 crests and variant crests, typically organized by subject and by type of crest. Natural elements, sort of flora, fauna, Buddhist references, geometric patterns, and so on and so forth. So, and you just kind of sort of leaf through them in search of stuff, and you have indexes at the end to try to find any specific one you have in mind. In some cases, these books have scholarly apparatuses at the end which give brief overviews of the history of these crests, and they'll tell you how the crest originated and how crests originated and how they developed. They all say exactly the same thing. Very few of them have any footnotes at all. Very few of them have anything more than basically interesting anecdotes when it comes to concrete examples of evolution of Mon. And indeed, overall, my growing sense is that the history of crests that everybody agrees with is assumed rather than actually carefully documented and substantiated. And so one of the reasons why this history is so flattened is that almost all of, and I guess this is the fourth proviso, almost all of the material we have, almost all of the actual historical material that we have on which these books are based is a product of the early modern period. That is to say, it's a period of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. All of this, therefore, is deeply retrospective with regard to the evolution of crests. And indeed, this sort of flattening of the past that we get in these catalogs is, I think, then sort of reproduced by popular culture, which looks at crests, even pre-1600 crests, without any sense of depth about what's going on. This here, maybe I shouldn't have the light on. It's a sort of grayish image. This is from the movie Ran. I don't know how many of you have seen it, by Kurosawa. It's a great movie. It has breathtakingly brilliant depictions of the chaos of war. As you probably know, Ran, the word Ran means political upheaval, disturbance, but at a deeper level, it means chaos, is what the movie is talking about. As you know, it's the story of King Lear. And here you see everybody is carrying his little flag, right, attached to his back. And everybody, each of the flags, this is a terrible image, but you can see a little better here, has a crest on it. A slightly better image, perhaps, is here. And here you can see a mass army. You see the infantry in the foreground, you see the cavalry in the back, and they're all carrying a crest. Now, they're also all dressed exactly in the same colors. And this is because at the very end of the Civil War, it is true that some warlords experimented with sort of a close approximation of uniforms to try to distinguish their own men from the enemy. But this was most definitely not the way an army would have looked, even in the 1600s. Whatever paltry effort at uniforms was made, it wouldn't be nearly as successful. And also, yes, sure, there would have been small units, each of which made up of homogeneously bannered men, but you wouldn't have a whole army colored all in the same color. It completely defeats the purpose of having a crest, if the purpose of the crest is to distinguish your family. And indeed, this is what helms or helmets looked like at that time. And you can see that well, I think the first thing you see is how flamboyant they are, right? And how flamboyantly individualistic they are. So for the moment, I'm just going to mention this for fun, but there's a reason for throwing this up, and hopefully I'll get my sort of talk in a shape that it will become apparent at the end brilliantly why this makes sense. So let me recite a little bit the history of Mon as we understand it. And by the way, I should say first and foremost, I don't mean to say that this history is completely wrong. I think it's reasonable, and there's various reasons why I think it's actually, by and large, the right picture. The problem is that it's impossible to substantiate. So, and that, as a historian, makes me anxious. It's more about being right for the right reason. Just because it happens to be what happened. So the first thing to know is that crests arrived in Japan from China, surprise, in roughly the 8th century. They arrived in Japan as embroidery. Also, this shouldn't surprise if you can read what it says, because indeed the two characters that make up the word kamon, the first one is house. I already told you a moment ago. The second one is made up, is a character, it's the character mon, that means the pattern, and it's made up of two radicals. The one on the left means thread, the one on the right means pattern. So it's pretty explicitly sort of representative of what's going on, at least etymologically. And in Japan, definitely, mon arrive as embroidery. It's only at a much later stage that they start getting printed and made in other media. Sorry. Early on, these patterns were, so what happens is these patterns arrive in Japan and they become quite popular. They become popular among the court nobility. I should clarify, they arrive in the 8th century. There are no warriors as a social class at this point in Japan. The country is dominated by a very tiny elite that we typically refer to as aristocrats or courtiers that numbered in its upper capital echelon probably no more than 2,000 people. And so early on, these patterns were little more than displays of personal taste. Though in a society that prized precedent to a really striking degree, people would often replicate their parents' taste as a matter, shall we say, of filial piety, to throw out a sort of easy Chinese label for the phenomenon here. What these were not, though, was heraldic devices in any pragmatic sense. These were not necessary to identify anyone in a society in which everybody knew everybody, probably much better than they wanted. And indeed, what they served, if they served any practical purpose, was to exalt the wearer's taste, his connoisseurship, and the subtle differences in sort of discretion, in aesthetic discernment between one person, one family, and another. If they did serve a practical purpose, is that people started getting carried away and stamping them all over their possessions, just because they looked good. And in actual practical terms, one thing that apparently they did was they helped people spot their vehicle in traffic jams or in parking lots. I know this sounds really stupid, but people used to use these ox-drawn carts, which were massive and lumbering, and they used to go to court with them. That was sort of the main social activity at the time. And people would go for certain designated events, and so sometimes the streets would actually become somewhat clogged with vehicles, and being able to spot yours was crucial. So, there was a practical use, and I guess you could say that there's a certain aspect of sort of recognizing something, making something visible, but I'm already 5 minutes to the end. When did I start? I thought I was 20 minutes in. Are we sure? Oh, goodness, I'm not even. Oh, really? Okay. Sorry, no, because so let me just skip here in that case, very, very dramatically. So there's lots of motifs, and these motifs that come from China are then supplemented with motifs from Japan. The date that is typically marked for sort of as marking the beginning of these crests as heraldic devices is the Genpei War that was fought between 1180 and 1185 between two sort of clans and coalitions of courtiers/warriors, the Minamoto and the Taira. Before that, there had been some disturbances, but they're generally dismissed by historians as very small affairs that didn't really require identifying marks because everybody knew who was involved. This is the first sort of nationwide war that takes place in which there's a large enough army that identification is necessary. But identification, since there are only two parties involved, really, remains fairly simple. And so the two sides, and this appears this is obviously a much later depiction, but it appears also in chronicles closer to the events. The two sides used red banners for the Taira and white banners for the Minamoto. And this was said to be more than enough. Eventually, the Minamoto win, by the way, in case you're wondering. What happens is that after the Minamoto win and occupy all of the sort of seats of power, all the positions of power, what comes to be needed, according to this traditional story, is differentiation among the various Minamoto. And so various devices are concocted for the very first time and superimposed upon the white flag. The lord of the Minamoto family itself retains a plain white banner. Everybody else gets some kind of stylistic modification that helps set them apart. And you can see that at the beginning, they're very, very simple. The rationale, we're told over and over, is that in Japanese-style warfare, which was essentially single combat between mounted warriors in fairly small encounters, it was necessary to be visible because you were often fighting on behalf of your lord, and you needed to show your loyalty and your prowess on the battlefield so that if you were wounded or that if you killed an enemy, you could then claim a reward. And so visibility and recognizability were of primary concern to everyone. And suddenly, we need emblems of this kind, very simple, very legible emblems, in order to be able to basically improve our position as a result of military engagements. It's also apparently believed that many of these emblems became, and then, by the way, these were printed on flags. They were printed on small little badges that were worn by soldiers who could actually conveniently discard them if they needed to change sides. They also could be essentially amulets. After all, it's easy to imagine that objects like these that had served in one successful battle could sort of be invested with all kinds of significance about one's chances of survival in a future battle. After about a century and a half of relative peace, after that war of the late 12th century, the country plunges into civil war again in the 14th century, and then again in the 15th and 16th century, basically war becomes endemic. At the same time, we have a proliferation of new houses because war is spreading and there's more and more parties involved in widespread battling. And so what we get, as you can see, are variant banners. Essentially, the Oyama is the main house. The Yuki and Naganuma are collateral houses, junior houses, and you can see that their crest is these are very obvious spin-offs of the Oyama basic model. What's important to consider, though, is that what didn't happen in Japan, and we saw a sort of very extreme example of what didn't happen in Japan in Steve's presentation yesterday, is you don't get what's called in Europe the marshalling of emblems. That is to say, you don't get emblems that are, what? No, this was supposed to do something. Hold on a second. Did it appear? Yeah. You didn't get that, right? Okay. No, this you see, obviously. There's something else that was supposed to happen at some point. Oh, well, I'm running late and my spiffy. Well, anyway, basically, I'm completely mystified. I'm sorry. I don't know why this is not doing what it was supposed to do. That. You don't get. Oh, I'm seeing it. Wait, I'm not on that slide anymore. Sorry. I apologize.
It's slow to respond sometimes.
Somewhat, yeah, but it has also a disturbing red band on the top of the screen, which usually is not a good sign. Sorry, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. All of this aggravation for that. Yes, well, you saw it, right? You saw it. We're not doing it again. So those were the sort of the contrast. The contrast between the two is very striking. Japanese heraldic emblems remain very coherent in terms of design. There are spin-offs, there are variations of all sorts. There's, you can reframe it, you can box it in, you can produce the negative, and so on and so forth. But you don't typically cobble together emblems in a hodgepodge. And this is significant. I'll come back to it very much in the second part of my talk. The idea that emblems were essential for recognition and for visual, for visibility in the battlefield is so entrenched in this received narrative that scholars tell us that in the 16th century, when individual duel-like warfare was replaced by massive armies with firearms and large contingents of foot soldiers, we're talking sometimes upward of 100,000 people per army, that at this point you need even more emblems. And you need individualized emblems so that if a family has to be deployed in two different parts of a sprawling battlefield, you can know which member of the family is where. And clearly, these later depictions, and here there's one that is slightly less later, in other words, it's from only a couple of decades after this massive battle in Sekigahara in 1600, you can see flags are everywhere, banners are everywhere, emblems, mon are virtually all over the place. And you could, if you know your mon well enough, you can spot who all the different characters are. So this is the basic story. What's interesting is that these mon are prompted by, the development of these mon is prompted by warfare and by the needs of the battlefield. Except once the story gets going, really the functioning of the battlefield doesn't seem to be terribly, doesn't seem to matter enormously to the way the use of Mon developed in subsequent centuries. And the evidence is really, really thin. As I mentioned, Mon are all from early modern catalogs. All of these are from early modern catalogs. And most of these catalogs, when they have anything but just a taxonomy of Mon, what they do is give pious stories about how one Mon was selected. Tokugawa Ieyasu, this one here, we saw it in green a moment ago. The story behind his selection of a Mon is that he was visiting a loyal vassal in a province during a particularly difficult and perilous campaign, and this vassal hosted him in his residence and offered him a plate with an arrangement of hollyhock leaves on it. And Tokugawa Ieyasu thought it was so delightful and variously auspicious that he decided to make it into his emblem. So what we might just think of as a circle is actually a plate with the leaves on it. I don't think it's necessary to buy this at all. There's other stories about, encounters with the Bodhisattva Kannon, and therefore there is something from that that makes it its way into the Mon. The stories are essentially moral tales for the most part, and they don't have a whole lot to do with bloodlines and genealogy in and of themselves. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Let me just note, the Tale of the Heike doesn't refer to Mon at all. The Tale of the Heike is the earliest, I'm sorry, the Tale of the Heike does refer to Mon only as flags. And not coincidentally, every account of a battle that is found in this famous Tale of the Heike, I'm sorry, this is what happens when I get frazzled. Let me reset this. I'm going to actually just skip a little here to reset myself. So, one of the problems is that the textual and visual evidence for Mon is fairly divergent. I mentioned that it was believed that in that first war in which Mon were used, simple colored banners served as crests of sorts. In truth, though, we don't really have any other evidence for that, and every depiction of the battle, of course, repeats this fact. But in truth, this fact comes from a war tale, an epic, that has many other very implausible stories in it. And so it's very hard to know if there's any visual evidence that is supported by other documentary sources other than this tale that was especially famous. In other words, it's like saying that the horse in Troy was factual because the Iliad talked about it, right? And we get the repetition of the motif over and over, but we don't really have any contemporary visual evidence, and we don't have any other textual evidence that talks about these Mon. The closest we have to contemporary evidence are a narrative illustrated scrolls called emaki. In some cases, some of these were fairly close to the events. The most famous of all emaki depicting military events is this one here that depicts the disturbance of the Heiji period. This was one of those disturbances that took place before the Genpei War. And indeed, look, there are no Mon. There are no crests of any sort, which is great because it corroborates our story to a certain degree. But it also raises the problem that maybe the whole reason why we think that there weren't more Mon before a certain time is because this famous scroll just doesn't happen to use them. Our sources don't talk about them, but our literary sources don't talk about them ever, really. Here's some other images to give you an idea. When the Mongol invasions roll around in 1274, we suddenly do see family crests. There's some questions here. The scroll depicting the previous disturbance and this scroll were produced almost at the same time. But the events they depict are fairly far apart. This opens up, obviously, other questions. But what I would say is significant is that this scroll is almost contemporaneous to the events and produced commissioned by a warrior who participated in the battle. He had the scroll, this man is called Kakezaki Suenaga, he had the scrolls made because he wanted documentary evidence, shall we say, visual evidence of his prowess. He then proceeded to take the scrolls to the warrior capital and submit them as evidence of his valor. So it's quite interesting that crests make their first appearance, visual, sort of incontrovertible appearance, in a depiction of battle that serves precisely to gain a reward. In other words, it's very hard to know whether the standard narrative that we have about the appearance of Mon as a way to be visible on the battlefield doesn't in fact simply reflect this and other such pieces of artistic production that were very much about sort of furthering one particular individual's agenda, and which were very much about making characters in a story sort of visible and recognizable within the narrative logic of a scroll. In other words, we don't have sources that talk about Mon other than depictions that are narratives. And here you can see we have narrative, suddenly we have crests galore. Again though, crests remain invisible in texts. Nobody mentions them. One particularly famous text is a 14th century epic called the Chronicle of the Great Peace, that is ironically entirely about a civil war. And in this epic, we are told by the standard narrative, crests are everywhere. And you know, I went back to the narrative and read it again. I assigned it every year for class. I couldn't find a single mention of a crest in the whole piece in everything I read, in any battle scene, in any parade in which warriors are described in minute detail, their armor, the color of their outfit, everything. You know, the horse's armor and protections. And so it remains doubtful. This image, needless to say, is a much later depiction that, of course, at this point accepts the idea that warriors must have crests. Sorry, I'm going to try to cut just a little bit. I have no idea how much time I have because you told me I was over earlier and the thing reset itself. So let me try to sort of get to my own thoughts here about Mon. Most work on Camon focuses on their visibility, on the battlefield primarily, and then in social life in general. It focuses on distinction, on the advantage of being recognized, and on affiliation, the need to be inscribed in a group. Indeed, describing crests, we tend to take it as a given that because crests rested symbolically on the framework of the familial group, their evolution must have occurred in tandem with the evolution of kinship. So if warrior houses developed unilineal succession and abolished partible inheritance around the 13th and 14th century, forcing non-inheriting kin to move out and start their own separate houses, so too then, those centuries, the 13th and 14th, must mark the time when crests reached maturity and became central to the identity and distinction between main and junior houses. And indeed, you remember when I showed you the graph of all of these new crests appearing, the very simple ones, and then I showed you the divergent crests. That's also the 13th and the 14th century. That's when we're told suddenly crests become really, really vital. But having accepted that Camon were linked with the house or the family, we don't probe the link further. Our focus is on how Camon grow out of danger on the battlefield and out of concern with honor. Yesterday, Steve mentioned the centrality of genealogical concerns to heraldry. This is certainly true in the case of Japan. If the battlefield provided the impetus, genealogy provided the logic. So let me step back from the battlefield and actually think about how Camon functioned genealogically. This is frozen again completely, sorry. Is it? Okay. As mentioned, Camon did not marshal emblems, so genealogical functions were not carried out by enumerating ancestors in the ways coats of arms in Europe did. Rather, Camon served as shorthand signifiers, like the mnemonics that Steve mentioned yesterday. They served as textual references textual references to Camon tend to be about the crest's origins, as I've said. To those in the know, Camon spoke not so much of present glory or martial prowess or bloodlines, but of a single fount of legitimacy and, often enough, a single fount of wisdom and truth. Again, Tokugawa Ieyasu has an important meeting in his life, and we're going to commemorate that through the Kamon. And as a kind of mnemonic device, that's going to remind us of all of the glory that has come since. A strong genealogical awareness was central to the appeal of crests, both in peacetime and in wartime. The waxing importance of the patriline did not simply serve as the context for the proliferation of crest designs and for their ubiquity. Far more than the issue of recognition on the battlefield, which remained difficult amidst the mayhem of carnage and for which various protocols of witness and appeal were instituted anyway, what drove the surge in the crest phenomenon, I think, was a growing anxiety about affiliation and identity as older extended kinship groups gave way to corporate houses. Viewed in this light, it becomes clear that crests are just one facet, albeit a very visible one, of a broader semasiological culture. Take, for instance, the kao. Here's another example I'd like to give, and this is the Japanese version of the monogram. So I was going to explain what it is, but since we've had another great paper on monograms, I won't need to say what it means. A kao literally means a flowery imprint, but it's a written signature. This is, in fact, the way great lords signed their documents, and often this is the only signature they provide. There's no legible name anywhere on the document. And like signatures, they tended to remain fairly constant over time. They varied a little bit because they were handwritten, but they were mostly consistent for individuals, and indeed being able to recognize these monograms is a way to identify documents. Now here, what I have displayed are actually arrayed from left to right, the monograms of a number of different rulers. These are the rulers of the second military government. The top line is the main family, the main lineage. So the top are all shoguns. The second line are members of a junior house. The junior house had a lot of influence and authority because it was made into its members were made into viceroys of a large part of the country, but they often had a fraught relationship with the main house. And what's quite interesting is that you can see the main house doesn't really stick to the same Kamon design. Each new generation devises its own design. The junior line hews much more closely to the original, the founder's design. And what you can see is that in various moments of crisis, various men changed their kao as a kind of political manifesto to reiterate their affiliation with previous lords of choice. So when Mochiuji rose in rebellion against Yoshinori, who had used that monogram, shifts to one that looks much like his father's. Do I have it right? Yeah, shifts a lot to one to look like his father's, who was the most powerful member of the dynasty. When the next generation of junior members of the family decides again to rise in rebellion, Shigeuji changes his monogram from one that is somewhat personal to one that much more closely resembles the ones of the founder of the dynasty. And his opponent, where am I here? Sorry, upside down. They're supposed to be all circled, but I've given up on the PowerPoint. His opponent, on the other hand, had stuck with a monogram that looked like his father, who had previously defeated his father. So there is a very clear way in which the subtle modifications of the monograms serve to inscribe various individual lords within a genealogy and a sort of contain an implicit language of prestige. Oh, sorry, now it's working. Sorry, I'm going to skip through this really quickly. Okay. I'm just going to just show you this here. The rub about this whole discussion my whole argument so far that monograms and crests are part of a larger culture of concern with genealogy, is that genealogy in the case of the warrior house is largely fictitious. This is a chart of the extended Uesugi family, essentially made up of multiple different lineages, eventually, made up of many different houses. And you can see just how prevalent adoption is. And here's another one of another family, the Nagao family, and you can see how prevalent adoptions are here too. There are cases in which literally a father gave his son off for adoption and then had to find another son to adopt because he didn't have an heir. So it's almost the default mode of transmission of authority. And even from the outside, people were found. It's not all internal. Here's, again, the Uesugi example. I'm actually wrapping up. I'm going to conclude by returning to crests and have some sort of final thoughts, and I apologize if some of the journey in the middle has been somewhat discombobulated. I'll read, so I won't do anything crazy at this point. Inasmuch as they become vehicles for the recognition of someone's membership in a house and markers of a house's reification as clearly defined and ideally unchanging, crests also wore their own lie openly, revealing the ways in which the house served as an institution and a social nexus that was constantly open to renegotiation. There were no written rules concerning the design and adoption of crests through custom, though custom dictated that designs already in use by other houses could not be adopted for one's own house. There are caveats here for another time. Crucially, no houseman could adopt a crest too much like his lord's without permission. And permission was not rare, mind you. Many lords granted permission to use crests that were similar, but you had to seek permission. In one well-known and at least often retold example, one famous warlord crucified one of his followers for basically stealing his design. It's probably apocryphal, but it gives you the idea of how much, rhetorically, how important these were. But indeed, the point here is that crests were often granted as marks of honor. Even the imperial house came to have its own crest eventually and to bestow it upon the heads of the most important warrior houses. Indeed, in this case, the ones who had the monogram that I analyzed earlier. A certain prestige, a certain gravitas was recognized. And crests became essentially embodiments of formal authority, even as those who owned them may have lost all real power. So the imperial house's crest came to be coveted and eventually stolen outright as the emperor's actual power waned. And that great warrior house, which I've shown you, whose monograms I showed you, that great warrior house at the head of the military government, they too granted their crest as an honor to loyal followers. Although, ironically, they didn't grant their original crest. They granted the one they received from the imperial family. They were basically recycling the present. Indeed, many houses came to accumulate many different crests to be displayed on different occasions and on different objects. Housemen could use both their own and their lord's emblems, revealing the complexities of nested allegiances. Yet, unlike in Europe, as noted, or in the Islamic world, Japanese crests never became composites of multiple emblems, projecting the semblance of unity and coherence. And this seems to me the best measure of their social significance. Rather than attempting to account for the source of every drop of blood running through a ruler's veins, and after all, the ruler may well have been adopted, Japanese crests serenely acknowledge their alienability and artificiality. They signal the corporate nature of the house, which in not relying on blood actually assimilated all members more thoroughly than it would have if it insisted on retaining true genealogical distinctions. In this sense, perhaps, rather than about crests, we should be talking about trademarks. So perhaps in this case, the pre-modern world was not all that different from the modern examples I showed you. Thank you very much, and sorry for all the chaos.
Why don't we take one quick question?
Oh, sure.
While Stefano sets up
Yeah,
his,
sorry.
PowerPoint.
Yes.
Thanks. Unless there's another one, I don't want to take the one.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
But no, quite all right. The diagrams you showed us were by and large monochrome, and some of the paintings showed some interesting colors in the Hamon.
Yeah.
And I wondered if color was any part of the significance of it.
Yeah, sorry, it's one of the things I skipped because I was running so far behind it. They do tend to be monochrome, but they're not necessarily black and white. In other words, they could be green, they could be red. There was one at the beginning, I think the Mori one I showed you was kind of pale mango-colored orange. But there doesn't seem to be, as with European coats of arms, it doesn't seem to be a sort of a wild jumble of colors vying for our attention. Most of them are very, very simple in that regard. Pattern seems to be really what matters rather than color. Sure, I think it's still saying.
So you talked about some, and I've had this experience for him.
Turn it on. Do you have a password for this? Oh, yes, sorry.
Of the comic, right? Bootological features, formal features.
Yeah.
And yet they're associated with families. So this is something that's always confused me. Why would you organize a catalog based on formal features instead of based on genealogy?
You think, right? Yeah. Yes, because I did say, after all, that it's hard not to think that these books were produced primarily for people interested in discovering their own, perhaps, genealogy. I think because the impulse that, I know that many of these books are based on collections of crests. In one case, John Dower has a large collection that he shows. These later collections, I need to distinguish. The early modern collections of crests upon which the modern publications that discuss crests are based are often put together by, on the basis, the modern ones and the pre-modern ones are not always put together for the same object purposes, right? The modern ones are often based on collections of crests that were put together by tailors, for instance. So tailors would have their in-house catalog of materials that they needed for all of the possible customers that had come to them over time. And again, John Dower's is based on one particular tailor and printer in Kyoto who had more than 6,000. And so I think one reason why they retain these typological organizations is that the source material was organized typologically. And I think a genealogical organization would require a historical awareness that most of these publications profess to have, but don't actually really evince in any serious way. In other words, there's not really any effort to show how one crest derives from another one. The awareness of the variation is more because just there's a typology arrayed there, and when you compare enough of them, you can see that they repeat themselves, and often the families that have repeating ones are related.
Thank you, David.
Thanks. Very good.
Okay, our next and indeed last speaker is Stefano Bloch. Stefano is a postdoctoral fellow in urban studies here at Brown. Stefano.
As part of positioning this, I should tell you a tiny bit about the work I do as a social scientist. So my work on graffiti in the past few years, and also represented in the past couple of publications, is doing ethnography on graffiti, which is more of an autoethnography, to talk about the way in which graffiti writers move across and contribute to the urban landscape. So it's not so much a discussion of the aesthetics of graffiti, whether good or bad, but more about the performative production of graffiti and how that contributes to the identity of graffiti writers in really complex ways in terms of how they fit into their communities and don't. There are times, though, where I do work, especially when I give talks, not written work, where I do have to talk about the aesthetics of graffiti. And that's always hard for me because creating an aesthetic hierarchy where there is better graffiti and worse graffiti, I don't think does justice to what graffiti is actually doing in terms of contributing to urbanism. And I also have very strong opinions about what I like, which may differ very much from someone else's strong opinions about what they like. So as I always say about graffiti, you don't have to think it's beautiful, you don't have to think it's art, but you also are always wrong when you create a hierarchy in which there is artistic graffiti and that stuff that looks like scribbling, or that scribbling stuff. In all of my years looking at graffiti, I've never seen anyone scribble on a wall, ever, in any country I've been to. And when people have scribbled on a wall, you can call that street art because it's an intentional scribbling as a commentary on the fact that people think graffiti is scribbling. No one scribbles. Another part of the work I do, which is more toward publication, the scholarly work I do, is looking at graffiti and its relationship to violent crime. So in a study I've been doing for the past 2 years here at Brown with over 100 undergraduate student assistants, is in a way to challenge the orthodoxy of broken windows policing and the broken windows theory, trying to understand what is in fact the relationship between graffiti and violent crime, using a mid-sized city, typical mid-sized city, Providence, which on every scale is very similar to Salt Lake City, Tallahassee, and a few other mid-sized cities, and looking at what is that relationship. People believe, especially since the broken windows theory was published in 1982, coming after the Stanford prison experimenters' research looking at broken windows theory, people have come to believe that graffiti as a quality of life crime, as a form of disorder, will contribute to, and in some cases directly lead to violent crime. And people, from policymakers to lay people to academics, not many though, have believed this correlation, if not causation. And what I've done is collect, now we're looking at almost 10,000 individual geotagged points of graffiti across the landscape in Providence, and putting that up against, on a map, 9 years of geotagged crime data, pulling out the violent crime as determined by the FBI, and seeing, is there a relationship between where incidents of violent crime are and where the graffiti is produced. And what we have found, which even surprised me because I didn't think we would be as right as we thought we would be, is that there is, so far, the data is about 80% clean. So far, there is a relationship between violent crime and graffiti, and it's an exact inverse relationship. Where there is more violent crime across Providence, there is less graffiti saturation. And not just saturation in terms of wall covering, but the number of incidents of graffiti representing individual criminals, because graffiti is a crime. And in the neighborhoods that have almost no violent crime to speak of, there is much more graffiti saturation. And one of the things we had to do in training the undergraduates to geotag, collect this data, was to train them on the different categories of graffiti: gang graffiti, non-gang graffiti, political statements, personal statements, throw-ups, tags, slap tags, scribes, so that they could enter this into an app we created to determine exactly where the graffiti was. And I'll say something about the newest research, but that's still ongoing. And I really believe that that's going to challenge broken windows orthodoxy like no other research on graffiti has done, because no graffiti scholars, most of whom actually come out of Australia for many interesting reasons, have never actually determined where the graffiti actually is. They often rely on 311 calls, that is, citizens, community members reporting that there's graffiti in their neighborhood and want it cleaned up, which is not an accurate representation of where the graffiti is. So this is the first time it's actually been systematically collected, and I attribute that to the incredibly eager and helpful Brown students who, over 100 of them, were willing to put in hours and hours of work. And I'll say something in a few minutes, just a minute, about where my current social scientific work is on this. But what I want to show you today, and I feel like it's an audience where I don't have to make a lot of caveats or explanations or argue about the importance of actually looking at the writing on the walls, because you all do that so well, much better than me. So let's look into this. And just to make sure on time, because I don't know what time I started, I just want to... Okay. Okay, perfect, thank you. The first thing to keep in mind is that it is false to assume that the writing on the walls is more aligned with gang graffiti, but the quote-unquote beautiful, colorful, artistic stuff is somehow more aligned with what people often call hip-hop graffiti. First of all, hip-hop graffiti is a term that was invented in the 1980s. Systematic, stylized graffiti produced by members of a globally coherent graffiti community started in about the late 1960s. Gang graffiti, which as I'll show later, which is not just about violent territorial demarcation, started in Los Angeles in about the 1940s. So the idea that the scribbling on the walls is somehow not the artistic graffiti is not accurate, or just in the eye of the beholder. And something I just want to point out very quickly before we get into this is, from someone with a trained eye in any field of aesthetics or art appreciation, we have very conservative rules about what is in and what is out, what is good and what is bad. And as much as it's a subjective reading of what is good and bad, it's a very conservative system. Graffiti writing is, like all other forms of art production. So, for example, and this is, yes, based on my subjective reading, but I can't find many people who would disagree with me, because we in the graffiti community all adhere to the rules of graffiti. For example, this is excellent. This is not. This is really pretty bad. This is incredible. And the reason I point that out is because to most people, I can't see the difference. I think that's so interesting because it shows how conservative and rigid this so-called anarchic form of wall writing actually is. This is incredibly innovative, whereas this is not. This is terrible. This is incredible. So sometimes the idea that a so-called wild style from the East Coast is superior to a more simplistic, what people have called a Chicano style, or style that derives from placas, it's superior. It's not from the perspective of most people who adhere to this now global graffiti community. Here's an example of a throw-up which is breathtakingly good. This is by a local graffiti writer, and I wanted to include it because that simplicity is often mistaken for a gang placa or something that's not sophisticated or something that's not art. Based on the rules of style in this coherent graffiti community, that would be, to anyone I would ever imagine talking to, a brilliant piece. And here's one more example of a wall that to most of you very thoughtful people in this room who are very interested in text and images might not even be able to see the difference. The difference between, just to put it simply, a really bad tag and a pretty incredible tag. One of the most brilliant tags that has ever existed, and one that is not at all brilliant from this perspective. Now, training undergraduates to do research, we didn't have to train them according to this aesthetic hierarchy, thank goodness. But there is an aesthetic hierarchy here, and it's not just about aesthetics, it's about use of tips, use of cans, use of style, placement, and also just basic structure of the tag itself. Now, one of the things that comes up often is the distinction between graffiti art, and I never use the term graffiti art, I just use the term graffiti, and gang graffiti. This is gang graffiti. This is actually 1970s gang graffiti. This is very much not gang graffiti. In fact, the graffiti writers here are very much, usually as the vernacular goes, on the run from police and gang members alike. And you see the styles are very, very similar. If you look at the E's, these E's derive from these E's. This is the original West Coast-based Chicano style. This is a West Coast writer style from the late 1990s. Very similar. And what's interesting about how similar they are is often lay audiences, law enforcement, policymakers will often suggest or outright argue that if it's simple, if it's writing, if it's not colorful, it belongs to gangs and therefore is a sign of a violent neighborhood. More resources should then go into fighting the criminals in this neighborhood because of how much gang graffiti there is here. Another incredible fact that we have found in collecting over almost 10,000 pieces of individual graffiti tags across a sample of census tracts and block groups in Providence is, of those almost 10,000 points, we found exactly one piece of gang graffiti. The reason that's incredible is because I advise the Providence Police Department, Gang Task Force, I talk to policymakers, I talk to many academics, and I have lots of friends and neighbors who all try to convince me that certain bad neighborhoods have a lot of gang graffiti. Certain quote-unquote bad neighborhoods actually have no gang graffiti. There is almost no gang graffiti in Providence based on our sample. Gang graffiti in Providence fell out of fashion about a decade ago. There's almost no gang graffiti. The one piece of gang graffiti that we did find was actually written on the back of the Whole Foods on Main Street, by the way, which I think is funny. Now, stylized, systematic graffiti, or what some call hip-hop graffiti, or what mostly geographers, sociologists, and anthropologists in the early 1970s started to call loner graffiti, was something very distinct from gang graffiti. The first, what we call all-city graffiti writer, was Cornbread in Philadelphia in the late 1960s, and Taki 183 in New York City, starting at about 1970. And you see, it's it's not to judge as aesthetic, but it's a very rudimentary form of simplistic wall writing. It's a basic script that these individuals had that they applied to the wall. And it's very much not gang graffiti, and it's very obvious because it's so rudimentary. In fact, it was gang graffiti, placas as they're originally called, that were innovative in terms of their aesthetic and placement and style. Style and the art of writing actually belonged to gang members long before it belonged to so-called graffiti artists, who are now called graffiti artists to distinguish them from bad gang members who engage in violent acts. That's not how it has ever been in terms of aesthetics. What many people often point to as good graffiti, and I forgive you if you've said this yourself, but you're entitled to this opinion, but I like it when it's colorful and looks good and is artistic. That's good graffiti. That's graffiti art. From those members of the graffiti community, including some gang members, that's not always the case that this is the good stuff. In terms of a Kantian appreciation for aesthetic and a sublime, colorful image that speaks to our sensibility and is legible to us, yes, this is better. In terms of a hierarchy within the graffiti community, this type of work in this example, this is bad graffiti. Any graffiti writer would say, wow, I really appreciate the fact that this person is trying their best, but this is actually bad graffiti. To most lay people, I would imagine, even policymakers and law enforcement, this is good graffiti because it's colorful and it's mostly legible. People are duped by color. And I don't put people down for that. I am too as well. I'm too often. Here's another piece of quote unquote hip hop graffiti that within the graffiti community is bad graffiti. Now, again, subjective, yes, but it belongs to a very rigid, conservative understanding of what is good, what is bad, what is innovative, what is outdated, etc. Whereas this piece of what most people would probably, and I've done many, many, many interviews having people look at graffiti, what many people call scribbling is one of the most innovative tags in the past 20 years. This tag here by Revoke from MSK is one of the most innovative uses of tip, can pressure, and style out there. Very different from this that most people would want. Going back now to the true innovative styles and reliance on the early spray cans actually belongs to gang members. This is Chaz, a member of the Avenues 13 gang in Los Angeles. This picture is from either 1970, 71, or 72, and it's Chaz with his well-known death figure and his roll call on the recently concretized banks of the Arroyo Seco feeding into the Los Angeles River. His placement, his balance, his innovative use of letters is considered one of the best moments for any kind of graffiti, really coast to coast. What most scholars have talked about when they talk about gang graffiti is pointing out that gang graffiti is violently territorial. Gang graffiti is used to demarcate space that then gang members violently defend. So gang member does read violence because violence is enacted on behalf of the gang, and the graffiti is there to tell you to stay out. So most graffiti scholars, and many of whom work for police departments or are policymakers as well, will point to the geography of graffiti, which is actually very, very accurate. Most gang graffiti will have cardinal points, in this case, west side, and some term referring to their practice, their proclivities, their identity, in this case, Rifa 13. So this is West Side Crazy Riders X13, and I'll get back to the 13 in a minute, which is key for identifying gang graffiti, which is actually accurate, and it still is. Here you have more geographical clues. The V is for barrio, sometimes it's a B for barrio. The 13 again, this is the Big Hazard gang, and this here is one of the cliques. So this is probably the Rascal Locos. The Rascal Locos, a Pee-wee clique of the Big Hazard gang, and this is their barrio. However, this is not pointing to the fact that this is their barrio. They may be indicating that Big Hazard is their barrio. Here again, West Side, Eco Parque, which is from Echo Park, a district in Los Angeles, and the LS, meaning locos. In this case, you could see that the C is crossed out because of their beef or antagonism for crazy riders. So gangs will often cross out the letter that corresponds to one of their local rivals. And here's in that same area, here's Temple Street. Now, different from Big Hazard that proclaimed their barrio as Big Hazard, this one is actually pointing to their barrio. This is their hood. And a gang will only point to their hood or to antagonize a rival gang, say, no, this is our hood. So an arrow pointing down is actually very hostile in the way that scholars have pointed out, and they're accurate. This is about territorial demarcation and laying claim to space. And here are the Pee Wee cliques as part of the larger Temple Street gang. In some of my other research that I'm doing now is I've just written a piece that just the other day was provisionally accepted on the way in which policymakers and law enforcement actually confuse graffiti writers, that is mostly, but not always, members of a community that does not engage in systematic violence against other graffiti writers. The motivations are for fame, building the ego, adventure, fun, perhaps base motivations, but are not interested in violently defending their identity in a quest for that kind of fame. And I talk about how they're confused with gang members simply because people fail to be able to read the writing on the walls. So reading graffiti is not just about creating an aesthetic hierarchy, it's also misunderstanding who is doing that writing and for what purposes. While it's all equally illegal, graffiti is a crime of vandalism. In fact, in the state of Rhode Island, graffiti itself is the crime. It's not even categorized under vandalism. Graffiti is a crime. After 3 misdemeanor charges, it becomes a felony, which then makes you available for gang enhancement, which means you could have 10 years added to your sentence if it's believed that your felony conviction was the crime you committed was done in the interest of a group or a gang. According to the definition of what a gang member is in Rhode Island and 36 other states, being a crew member, being a graffiti writer is a gang member because there's no allowance for engaging in violent crime or territoriality. It's about style, identity, and engaging in criminal acts, which for the case of most graffiti writers is simply doing graffiti. And the piece I'm writing is looking at how these two mutually hostile subcultures are conflated in the interest of increased criminalization. So I show the Echo Park gang and how graffiti writers are swept up in what are called gang injunctions, the creation of safe zones to rid gangs from neighborhoods, when in fact these graffiti writers are being treated like gang members. There is the argument they should be treated as criminals because they are when they produce graffiti, but should they be treated like gang members for whom an injunction is trying to clear them away because of the nuisance that they create in terms of their violent activity? So that's a piece that I'm exploring right now. So I included this piece here for the Cypress Park gang that is actually pointing to their hood. The hood's usually coming off of main boulevards, down side streets. The location of our hood is here, with a for sale sign showing houses are also for sale down here. So the battle between gang members laying claim to space and real estate agents laying claim to space, new incoming citizens and residents laying claim to space. So the battle is not just between Cypress Park and Echo Park, but Cypress Park and incoming homeowners, the process of gentrification, police injunctions, etc. One of the key characteristics of all gang graffiti is the 13. The 13 is only going to be used in gang graffiti. Never will a 13 be used in non-gang graffiti. And the 13 in this case, the 13, and the 3 dots standing in for mi vida loca, my crazy life. That's what the 3 dots stand for. The 13 points to the 13th letter of the alphabet, which could mean many different things. M for mota, which is marijuana, M for marijuana. And this has never been directly proven, to use that term, but starting in about the 1950s, the affiliation that local street gangs had with the Mexican mafia. So the 13 pointing to M, which is La M, meaning Mexican mafia. And Trece gangs, as they're known, all pay their allegiance to the Mexican mafia more so when they're in prison than when they're on the streets. The idea that street gangs are all engaged in a sophisticated drug trade is simply not true and has never been proven by social sciences. In fact, all social sciences point to the fact that the vast majority of gang members either have nothing to do with a sophisticated drug trade or are very petty peddlers of of drugs that also pay their allegiance to gangs. So the idea that they're part of the Mexican mafia as part of a drug distribution network is less the case than young cholo gangs on the streets of mostly Los Angeles, where the 13 comes from, because it also stands for Sureño, South Side, which is Los Angeles in Southern California. It means that in the prison system, they'll have protection as one big gang. That is the Mexican mafia, which distinguishes itself along racial lines from the Aryan Brotherhood, white inmates, the Black Guerrilla family, black inmates. And as I'll show you in a minute, now increasingly subcategories. But the Trece is the big gang in prison. And the Trece goes back to at least the 1950s. Here's a picture I dug up when I was a grad student and it was negative 20 degrees outside because I was at Minnesota, and after hours and hours and hours of looking through old databases of images through Los Angeles Times, the Herald, the city, the Department of Water and Power has one of the most incredible photo archives. I came upon some examples of graffiti like this one that include the Trece, and that's Happy Valley. Happy Valle, as they also used to call it, which was a clique, a neighborhood, using the Trece and based on their clothing in the 1950s. Some people who have entered the Trece realm are non-Chicanos, non-Latinos, and specifically non-Mexicans. Non-Mexican gang members in Los Angeles have been invited into the Trece realm, except for one group, and that's Salvadorians. So as immigration increased from Central America and to some degree South America, the less so, and to some small degree the Caribbean on the West Coast I'm talking about now, they've all been invited into Trece gangs that previously identified as Mexican American or Chicano, but those lines easily blurred, except for Salvadorians who came over as a result of the 1980s civil war in El Salvador, but actually met up with existing U.S. citizens of Salvadorian descent who had started a gang on the streets of L.A. There was actually a heavy metal gang called Mara Salvatrucha. Mara Salvatrucha, called by the FBI as the most violent Chicano gang. They're not a Chicano gang, they're a Salvadorian gang, almost exclusively. And Salvadorian gang members use the Trece because only in prison are they allowed to, as they call it, kick it with La M. On the streets, that is not the case. But this is an interesting example because Armenians started coming over right before and much more so after the fall of the Soviet Union. So by 1990, there were more and more Armenians coming who had previously come but had settled in Watertown, Massachusetts, Fresno, more agricultural areas, industrial areas. But by 1991, we're coming to Los Angeles, and they were coming specifically to East Hollywood. So here you have Armenian power. These are Armenian gang members who are laying claim, their barrio, notice the use of Spanish, though it is crossed out, to a particular neighborhood that's otherwise occupied by Chicano gang members. And they've had notorious hostilities, more so than the hostilities between the Salvadorian gangs and even the Filipino gangs, which are some of the biggest gangs in LA traditionally. Pinoy Real, the Rebels, and Asian Boys are all almost exclusively Filipino gangs who have had hostilities with Chicano gangs, but Armenians who are part of Armenian power really went to war with Mexican gangs in the 1990s, though relied on the Trece. This baffled gang experts for years. I've looked at many gang documents from gang experts saying, why are Armenians claiming the Trece when there's no evidence that they have an affiliation with the Trece? It was simply because once Armenians started moving into the prison system in higher and higher numbers, they adopted the Trece because they found allegiance with the Mexican mafia as opposed to the Aryan Brotherhood. Even though in terms of the social construction of race and identity, Armenians would have more kinship with Armenian power. It didn't work in the California state prisons. Armenians become Chicanos once in prison, and on the streets, they're allowed the Trece, even though they have no affiliation with Trece gangs. Something else happened around the 1990s, and that was the growth of the 14. The 14, and here La Raza, and this is Silent from La Raza with the 14, and Little Casper. Little Casper relying on a much more kind of traditional, almost graffiti style. I use graffiti as non-gang graffiti, but Silent here crossing out his S, either because of personal antagonism or a gang beef, but the 14 was used to indicate norteños. Norteños were Chicanos, or Mexican immigrants who came up into California in greater numbers starting in the 1980s to work in agriculture. And they began to distinguish themselves from Sureños, who were more likely, as they said, to join gangs. We're more about the pride of our race, La Raza, our race, our people. And they began to use the 14 because they said, not only do we distinguish ourselves from Sureños when in California on the streets, and that means hostility, everything from mad dogging, bad looks to drive-by shootings, but even in prison, we're going to distinguish ourselves. So kind of the La M empire of the prison system in the 1990s started to crumble a little bit because other Mexican, ethnically Mexican or nationally Mexican individuals were not affiliating themselves with the Mexican mafia because they were something else. And you'll give me a time, right? Okay, good. I'm good. Perfect timing. Now I want to go back for a minute because what is clear in the research on graffiti is that there's many ethnic, nationalist, racial hostilities between gangs and affiliations. What's also clear is that gang graffiti is territorial in many ways. It's geographic. Gang graffiti is there to tell you who lays claim to that space with the cardinal points, the arrows, etc. What some scholars have pointed out in the past, starting about 10 years ago, was that we need to be better at reading graffiti because it's doing something else. It's also talking about kinship and love. Speedy con Maria, Speedy with Maria, or con amor, with love for Maria. So next to a gang tag would be usually in Spanish, an appeal to love for a particular female written by a male. There was also more reading of graffiti to show that gangs are actually writing the names of other gangs to show unity between gangs. And I haven't pointed out any predominantly black gangs in this group, but in Los Angeles, black gangs were actually taking to the wall, not just to declare territory, but to declare unity between those who identified as black or African Americans, and in an attempt to bring the Bloods and the Crips together, specifically after the 1992 justice riots in Los Angeles. So there was a lot more community building, you might say, being written on the walls that was not just about exclusion, but was very much about inclusion. And I agree completely. But there's something that's been left out of the research on graffiti, and this has only come to light in the past few years because of a photographer named Howard Gribble, who took pictures through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s of graffiti, and that's a rare thing to have these images of old school graffiti. And what you could see in this old graffiti is another type of identity building within the graffiti that wasn't just territorial and wasn't about antagonism, but it was about positioning oneself in terms of politics. Early graffiti, this all now is from the 1960s and 70s, was making appeals, you might say, to the royalty, the mighty squires with a crown. And these are all Chicano gangs, by the way, all of them. and West Coast. Here you have a female gang, Las Cholas, Queen, La Shotgun, the tres they use here, La Gata. These are all females. But the term king, the term queen, which would later be used by members of the graffiti community, a king being the dominant, most prolific graffiti writer. Here you have the royal saints, also the use of religious iconography, the cross, but along with the saint and the royal together, royalty and religion together to show their prowess and their power. Here in 1970, again, you have a roll call of writers, and these are Los Santos Royales. These are the royal saints. It seems to some to be a contradiction, but it's making appeal to two groups, and it's not just a location. What also happened in the 1970s is after the appeal to royalty and sainthood was a growth of a more politicized Chicano movement in the 1970s, which I'll only spend a minute on because you either know a lot about this or there's so many resources you can learn about this. And there was a reinvigorated interest in the three muralists, Siqueiros, Rivera, and thank you, Orozco. And this renewed interest was in this case, Siqueiros' mural, America Tropical in downtown Los Angeles, in which Siqueiros depicted an indigenous man being crucified on a cross with the sign of American imperialism hanging over him. And that interest invigorated and helped create a Chicano mural movement, a critical Chicano mural movement. Here is what's considered the first radical, critical Chicano mural in Los Angeles, The Wall That Cracked Open, in which Herón included images of what he said were his ancestors coming through a wall that was marred or tagged with gang graffiti, which was original gang graffiti that he left integrated into his mural of his ancestors, which was painted for the beating of his brother. And of course, more Chicano murals painted all around Los Angeles that were more politicized. So you have images of Zapata, images of Che Guevara, We Are Not a Minority, 1970s. David Botero, his image here showing the lineage of Mexican ancestors from contemporary on back, Aztec, Cholo, Pachuco. So it was a community that was becoming increasingly politicized, that most of you know this story of the politicization of Latinos in Southern California. Judith Baca talking about neighborhood redevelopment in Elysian Park or Chavez Ravine, families torn apart by the construction of the federal highway system, destroying their homes, bulldozer blades coming in, wiping out where they had lived for generations, people being carried away by the police, and in this case, while Dodger Stadium lands like an alien spacecraft in their community, the privatization of their space. And here's some images of graffiti itself speaking to that politicization. Viva Chicano Power in the 1970s. Gang members, in this case Maravilla, posing in front of a Chicano mural, not in front of their own graffiti. So the Chicano mural came to symbolize politics. And then graffiti itself became more politicized. And here you have graffiti from the 1970s of the Brown Berets, radical Chicanos looking for change, not just integration. And the last part of this, which I'll finish with, is and I only have a few images of this because this is the part of the politicization of Chicano gang graffiti and gang members that is not included in murals. It's a different type of politicization that people have not written about. People have not written about this, and those who have discussed it in ways that I simply don't agree with. And that is here. Here you have gang graffiti in the 1970s, including Chicano Power, but with certain curious signs. That's Venice 13, by the way. Here you have even earlier, early 1970s, again, the use of the swastika, in this case, technically backwards, which I'm gonna say one thing about. Jardín with the swastika, Jardín, the two swastikas, and a 13. Many people have pointed out, especially those who do work on gangs, that this was the inclusion of the backward swastika, meaning traditionally peace, that predates the Nazis. in all of the interviews I've done, because I'm an ethnographer, no gang member who is now a veterano, an older gang member, has acknowledged that it was anything different than a use of simply a powerful symbol. A powerful symbol that, in fact, finding this image, disputes the idea that the swastika is being inverted with the name Hitler here. The S18, 18th Street, one of the oldest gangs in LA, someone who calls himself Hitler from 18th Street. And what I gather from looking at this type of politicized gang graffiti is that gang members were not just looking for a political identity that they found in the critical Chicano movement, and later even in the non-gang graffiti movement, but they were looking for a political identity, and sometimes that identity relied on using stark, powerful images that simply angered the mainstream. There was an ignorance about what the swastika meant, just like I believe there was an ignorance about what the reliance on saints and royals meant in earlier gang graffiti, the reliance on kinghood and being a queen. I believe that what gang members were doing were being iconoclastic. They were using symbols that they knew were powerful and knew meant a lot, and it actually perhaps did not bother them that this spoke to some kind of white supremacy or being Aryan. It just meant that we're different, we're tough, we're angry, we're mean. We're declaring territory, not just with cardinal points written on the wall, but with swastikas too. A swastika was someone who calls himself Little Killer. Here's Deadeye from Diamond Street with a swastika. And finally, Viva Dogtown, one of the oldest gangs in LA, with a swastika in the middle. No evidence of an affiliation with Chicano gang members and what became known as the Aryan Brotherhood, or white supremacists at all. It was about the power of the image. And the reason they were interested in the power of the image was because this was a community that, after years and years of economic and urban structural restructuring, were looking for a political identity that, in this case, gang members found in what was emerging as one of the most powerful symbols that enraged the mainstream, against whom Chicanos would fight for generations after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. You've elucidated the writing on the wall, literally. Couple of quick questions before our concluding remarks.
I'm happy about any part of this. I'm happy to field. Yes?
Just so curious, if you can go back to like one of your first slides, can you
Sure.
just give us one example?
Yeah.
Why was it bad and why was it good? I really wanted to know.
I will hang out with you for the next 5 hours
You
to
can tell me
explain,
all about it,
but
just
very
one.
quickly.
I couldn't really tell, like the one that
Like I said, it's very, very subjective.
Yeah.
It really is. But, and I don't mean to get too technical, and I don't use the term graffiti art, but let's get kind of RISD artists for a minute. I gave a couple of talks at RISD earlier, and I did do this, and I didn't like myself for it. I feel good as an ethnographer and a social scientist, but I'm going to do this. Simply because the use of the tip here shows a can that has full pressure and a soft use of the tip, and the seed dips in flawlessly before moving to an eye that has a pretty hard, though softened at the edge, angle down, a deliberate N with just the perfect amount of drip, and then a fading K, and here's what's very important, a very deliberate, showing a sign that you know your craft, of a K that goes like this. It goes perfection. I mean, that's talent. Whereas this is somebody who's not as comfortable with the can, who probably, and I don't mean to make one of them better. Yeah, I do. This is a use of the can. It's too close. There's too much paint coming out. The person was hesitant right there. You see the dip came almost to a close and had to stop. A bad angle on the eye, a Y that is doing this ridiculous thing that you shouldn't have done, with really insecure underlines. Those are insecure underlines. Where this is a secure underline with dots that show the type of tip. Do you see the heathering here?
Yeah.
That's to show the type of tip that was used. This person doesn't show the type of tip. So for so many reasons, this is not secure, this is secure. This, however, is a perfect tag. This is a D, a C, a Y, a P, a H, an E. Look at that, all the way an R. That says decipher. It's so good that it's bad because it's almost cliche what perfect graffiti that is. So this person is not good because it's almost like a pop song. This is a pop song. This is somebody who's just like, it doesn't have the right tone. And this is somebody who is confidently singing in a new way, but in a recognizable style. That's why. And I can go on and on for about 10 hours, but I won't. So you see there's a lot to be read in there. There's so much. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Because you're obviously working on graffitis in the United States.
Yeah.
But really, is there any connection, relation, stylistic, artistic, whatever, with graffiti made in different scripts in Arabic world, for example? I don't know, like China or Japan, if there are graffitis. I mean, are these completely separated worlds, or there is some influences going?
There's graffiti all over the world. There's graffiti all over every city. If you walk in any neighborhood in Providence, there's graffiti on just about everything. You just might not see it, but it's there. But across the world, what I have found in traveling the world for various reasons is that people have imported mostly the quote-unquote wild style of New York graffiti that started in about the early 1980s and really grew up in the 1990s. That's the dominant style. However, and I'm going to get to the Arabic script in a minute. However, there are other cities that totally did away with the quote-unquote wild style of New York City graffiti and imported a type of West Coast LA cleaner, it's called cleaner, a cleaner style that actually comes out of gang placas from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, up until 1984 when systematic stylized graffiti hit the streets of LA. And that type of graffiti is known to be clean, legible, fatter, bolder, angrier, more aggressive. And there's parts of the world that rely on that style. So for example, Berlin and Los Angeles have everything in common. But Copenhagen and New York have everything in common. And Rome has everything in common with Mexico City and Los Angeles. But Japan has everything only in common with New York and Philadelphia. So I don't know what the reason is for that now. I hope to have a long career and write about that as well when I'm done with the other 50,000 things I'm doing this week. But as far as Arabic script, graffiti that is done in the Arabic world, as well as the larger region of the Middle East where many Arabic individuals and communities are, as well as Muslim societies, import mostly a wild style, typically American aesthetic. And when they do rely on the native script, the indigenous script, it's for political reasons as opposed to identity, self-aggrandizement, ego. What has happened, though, is that the West Coast of the United States has brought the Arabic script to graffiti in LA, more so than New York. So LA graffiti writers since about 2001 have adopted an Arabic script for their own name. So it's an anglicized Arabic script that got really big from about 2001 to about 2006 and has since kind of faded away a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you left this up because thank you for explaining what the difference was in aesthetic quality and the technique, the skills of the writers, which is helpful, but it's just another enclosed group. It's like the American Kennel Club that says this is a good dog.
Right,
that's a
right.
bad dog.
Very conservative group, graffiti
Yeah.
writers are, yes.
But functionally, did the hack who wrote Smog City think he was doing something different? I mean, what was the purpose? It may have had less skill.
Yeah.
Is it functionally, intentionally different in some way?
It seems to me from here that Smog City is trying to do what Sync was doing and just can't do it as well, just to be blunt. Whereas, and this is pretty innovative. This writer, he's not trying to be as innovative. But here, X-Ray 1 is very, very innovative with the use of these quotation marks, the traditional halo over the top. This is very innovative, where again, this is not innovative, this is just perfect. This is the Katy Perry of graffiti. Whereas here, Jill, Warner, Misty, and I can't see who that is, those are female graffiti writers. And because it's such a male-dominated subculture, and a very machismo subculture, that nevertheless has had contributions from females that have grown graffiti. Some of the most prolific writers in the history of graffiti have actually been female graffiti writers. But that doesn't challenge how machismo and male-dominated the graffiti world is. But what you'll often hear about female graffiti writers is, for a girl, they're good, which is very dismissive and sexist. But what I have found about female graffiti writers is female graffiti writers, for a variety of, I think, very interesting social and geographic reasons, more closely rely on traditional gang plaka styles. So female graffiti writers write more like gang members than male graffiti writers. And that's been the case for about 25 years now. And then, because I'm an ethnographer and I've done so much work in this community, there's also reading into the script, the image, the aesthetic that makes it good for reasons other than the aesthetic alone, for social reasons. For example, this baser here is not good. That is a terrible tab. But Baser is a legend in the graffiti community. He was doing graffiti when most of the people on this wall weren't alive yet. So because of that history and that contribution to the community of graffiti, aside from the aesthetic of graffiti, that's a legendary tag. Where that's not a legendary tag, that's just an aesthetically wonderful tag.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So our last two speakers need no introduction. Our organizers, John Bodell and Steve Houston, will lead the concluding discussion and concluding remarks.
Steve, you want to present your...
I don't really have anything formal to present other than to elicit from our audience and our public whether they might have any general points to make about what seemed to be motifs that jumped and lurched and went from talk to talk and then back again. For instance, I think that many of the pieces we've been listening to over the last couple of hours in particular dealt with the matter of identity, and I was struck, particularly listening to Stefano's presentation about the emotional clout that many of these would have. And this also came up, I think, in Ildar's presentation, that we see them in these dry emotive terms the way academics tend to do, but they would also have probably had some sort of punch in the solar plexus. And this would be absolutely coming through in Stefano's presentation. I think it's also another point of discussion which we can bring up as well is the boundedness of these systems. It took Stefano going through these to explain exactly what the sequencing might be, what this or that emblem might be. Perhaps this is general knowledge. It certainly wasn't to this community or to us. I imagine John, maybe John does this in his spare time, and I can just see him out there at midnight with this can of spray paint. But that is a point that did come up repeatedly as to who is establishing these conventions, who is telling others about what their meaning might be, who is invited into that conversation. And that brought up another point also by way of thematic preoccupation within the last couple of hours, and indeed in the last day and a half, which is who is making these, who are they intended for, and it's that social matrix of the making and the understanding that also is something that I think interests all of us. John, did you have any points you wanted to bring up as well? And
Well, a number of things that occurred. One is perhaps, Ed was thinking of Stefano's discussion of what he called the swastika, which we would most of us call a swastika today, but as others of you know, was a pattern that existed for a few millennia with a perfectly innocuous context as a border decoration. I don't have a piece of chalk here, I suppose, to illustrate another one, but this figure, after about the era we call...
make your mark.
Yeah, here's my mark.
Make it.
What does that look to you like? I bet 90% of you would say it's a cross, and you would think of Christianity or a Christian cross because of the dimensions. But of course, again, this symbol occurs in all kinds of places. Would that be a tagging sign by inverting it like an inverted swastika? I mean, how closed are these systems? Or when does a particular SEMA something like that, acquire in one particular social context so much power that it's hard to use it subsequently detached from that symbolic significance. This is, in fact, I think, what the taggers are relying on, so that it can be noticed that it's not a swastika, which we would call it then, but an inverted one. If you have no directionality to your notion about the way that image appears, as in fact is a decorative motif, it can go left or it can go right. It's just like an egg and dart motif. It's only acquired a semantic significance thanks to Hitler, which can then be reversed by turning it the other way. In the same way, at one point before the era CE, this would have been equally significant. After CE, we tend to associate this image with the way it's imagined that Jesus was crucified. In fact, there were many crucifixions that were performed just like this, upside down in the ancient world. But because of our imagination and the iconicity of the images of Jesus, this one becomes iconic and this one doesn't. It's actually a fiction, too. So, I mean, I'm rambling now, but I'm interested in the idea about how, because these look very much like some of the most simple signs we had, going back to Ferraris yesterday. The cross, I mean, the two cross lines is one of the simplest marks. And yet, how can such a simple pattern be so loaded that it really is hard to detach it from that significance now? Steve showed us yesterday the Arlington Cemetery patterns, where you can tell the Wiccans from the Muslims, from the Jews, from the Christians, just from a little sema at the top of their sign. And yet even the Star of David was not necessarily before a certain period a sign of anything. It's just another geometric symbol.
I would say another dominant theme that has played like a melody through many of the presentations is exactly this. It's the instability of the meanings or significations attached to some of these.
Yeah.
And this is a point I made in my introduction, but also it was brought up by Steve, by David Spafford and others, in which they accrue different meanings. There's a subtle modulation. And then I think it's an entirely separate matter, in addition to the one I just mentioned, is that relation to language. And in Ildar's presentation, we saw that there were letters composed there. And yet, again, the visual or graphic impact it was supposed to have was as something apprehended almost immediately, as understood as that particular cipher, and not to be laboriously decoded, perhaps, but certainly meant to be contrastive. So we have, I think Steve in particular articulated this point very well, and I also touched on it in my introduction, which is that some of these sorts of systems only seem to come into existence as piggyback, so to speak, on what we would, some of us would regard as writing, that is, with a truly developed phonic dimension. And so that did also seem to be a theme worth emphasizing once more.
And my little example of the brick stamps, Besales marked with the consular date, is another combination. Each one independently is meaningless, but it's text with the stamp that matters. Yes, the instability, just while we're thinking of issues that came up, Ben's comment about this, and the Mon also, the fact that these can be passed around, or when chief sign is vacated, it can go to a different person. It can be adopted out, it can be lent out. You suggest that these permissions were fairly commonly granted. So very unstable. What a particular sign meant, I guess, chief would depend, you'd have to get the generations.
I thought Berenice's presentation was really, really quite beautiful, very elegant, and showing too that it's about the making. And you probably would also bring this up too, I imagine, Stefano, which is that there's a certain furtive degree of activity involved. I imagine this is not being done in full display of the LA police force. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You don't presumably want to get caught. You're not doing it brazenly to that extent. But the making of these, of who is privileged to make them, who is entitled to make these marks. I imagine if you went out to do one of these gang signs in broad display of, let's say, members of that gang, this would not be probably regarded with great pleasure by that community. So again, it gets back to the sociological dimension of how these things are actually created. And then also the fact that it's not just the product, it's the entire process. I've been privileged to teach this course, as you know, with Professor Moser, Jeff Moser, this semester on the pictured text. And it might be interesting also eventually, maybe over a beer later or a glass of wine before dinner, to think also about the aesthetic matters of how they compose these. Ildar's very beautiful monograms were clearly involving some kind of design sensibility, and Steve's comment, Chris Malice's comment, he was commenting on this as well. And when you, Stefano, were describing the luscious beauty of those lines, it sounded like Jeff Moser describing a particularly fine example of sung brushwork. And so there is a kind of transcendent vocabulary, at least, of describing the world of ink. But
Jeff?
Can I say something? on
Please,
that?
Yeah.
please.
Because actually, my sense if I listened to your entire presentation was that I wanted to co-teach you. Because the vocabulary that you use, the structure of your analysis was so analogous to the way we analyze Chinese calligraphy. It was shocking how close it was. And I sort of wanted to make a full, you sort of talked about aesthetic analysis and then sort of talked your way back, because if you don't want to engage too seriously in aesthetic analysis, it's clearly ideologically problematic for you. And I guess what I wanted to say in defense of art history and aesthetic, or visual analysis at least, is that it strikes me that there is a way that you could take at least part of the narrative that you were saying and make it, and socialize it, have it have a social outcome. Because one of the sort of core elements of the story, and this is sort of something I think many of the papers brought up, this sort of tension between the semiotics of the explicit sign in the mark and the semiotics of the form in which that sign is delivered, came up for you because when you do the aesthetic part, which is really the formal analysis part, it struck me that you really are talking about basically a tension between two competing aesthetic systems. One, the aesthetics of the market, which in your story is represented by largely white suburban prospective homeowners who like color
Right.
and who like certain kinds of form, right? And it's sort of a mass market aesthetic. And the aesthetic of an in-group that's interested in stroke and pressure and the qualities, in this case, monochrome paint, but those qualities are totally analogous to monochrome ink.
Yes.
And that in fact, by articulating that distinction, you then are able to demonstrate that what we're really seeing here is a struggle over the market and over, on one hand, one community that's competing for cultural capital and another community that's competing on the basis of actual financial capital.
Yes.
And so that's the story that we tell about the history of Ming painting. So there's all sorts of remarkable parallels that I think if you seem like you're going that way, and I just think that that telling that aesthetic side of it might actually help make the larger social arguments that you're committed to making.
I only tell the aesthetic side in some circles.
when you're among
So
friends.
that's right, I could do
Fair
that.
enough, fair
Yes.
Other comments or thoughts? Either picking up ideas Steve and I mentioned or bringing up some other themes that you noticed, and many of you have been sitting here and been thinking about these things for several days.
No, I just was thinking about fuzziness of some definitions, not just science but definitions that we are using. Because Stefano started his presentation by saying that graffiti are not script, no one is scribbling or scratching graffiti in the same way, but for an late antiquity, especially in the late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, graffiti is something that was inscribed, scribbled, and this would be some kind of obscenities written at night about your neighbor or about someone's wife, and everyone more or less was involved in that activity, and there is no aesthetic toward it. So obviously graffiti in your subject and in my subject describe something different. But on the other hand, there is a discussion currently that the term magic and magical is a rather value-loaded term to describe or rather to marginalize certain phenomena. So those phenomena that are not accepted by official church or official ritual practices would be described as magical. The same thing with graffiti. So these are those types of writing that are viewed as marginal or illegal would be getting this type of definition. So it's in a way very much value-loaded term, and to that extent, how valuable the term graffiti as a descriptive term in this case, because for specialists in early medieval writing, they would describe this as calligraphic writing. And it's very much similar to calligraphic on the walls of some Muslim churches. So the style works.
And another point that might enter into this particular discussion is not just this as an ethereal sign that's floating here, reproduced in digital form, but that it was on someone's wall. And I would venture to say probably the person who sprayed it didn't have legal title to that wall. I'm not sure if they spray paint their homes. Do they do that as well? Or is it?
I've had friends who do.
Yeah, but my point is that often, as with Howard's material, and with some of the pots we saw that might have some of these marks, it's about the supposition that there will be transfer of ownership of that material object on which these particular massigraphs or signs have been attached. And so it's not just these as, let's say, a free-floating system to be contemplated in an abstract manner, but also what they're on, why they're on that, the nature of the material, is it a gold crucifix, and the fact that it's inherently involved not only in a material transaction, but a social one, which it's about to pass off into other hands. The bricks are going into, from this community that's been charged with making them, presumably, we don't really know what's going on, but into this building, and that is a kind of a trace of a social interaction that is, I think, implicit in a lot of these objects we're looking at in terms of identity marks.
Just to add to that, one of the themes that has really come out with me throughout our time here is our issues of confidentiality and combination, the way that marks relate to marks and marks relate to text. We're not talking about things that exist in isolation, whether it's these fascinatingly composed monograms that Ildar has talked about, or whether that's the way that in graffiti that directional signs, abbreviations, all of the numbers are all being combined into this sort of componential morass, but these don't exist outside of structure and patterning. And part of what I think we're thinking about here is I think it would be entirely possible to look at this and say, oh, that's chaos, but that's not chaos. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of what we've been discussing today is the way in which meaning is structured together, both integrated with traditional text as considered in terms of literate product, but the way in which semasiograms or marks are integrated with other marks in terms of structured systems.
And I had to throw this up because when I was asked why are they together, is Baser the first one? Is he the exalted ancestor in this genealogy of calligraphic expertise? And also they're remarkably respectful of the space that they're occupying. I don't see them necessarily superimposing. Partly that's for reasons of clarity, I imagine, but there's also a sense that that is a certain kind of trace, a vestige of a person. It's his remnant there, and it's going to be respected to some extent when you execute your other mark nearby. Sheila, sorry about that. Yeah.
It's to my point, which is, yes, there is respect and they are coexisting, and oftentimes these texts or marks are parts of ongoing conversations across generations. But there's also the issue of erasure and destruction by painting over of graffiti, desired or undesired. And the wonderful example of the destruction of those Genet, which are meaningful. And so the rupture or erasure or destruction of text is an issue.
And almost a beautiful sense of a lifetime. It has a life, and then it has to disappear at Easter, and then it will come back again to some extent. Not meant to be permanent necessarily.
This last talk was fascinating in a number of ways, and one of them is how much an outlier it's been for our topic. Given that we've already had addressed the issue that by graffiti was meant in this talk entirely a spray painted material, whereas through most of history and most other contexts, the graffito is of multiple media possible for making. And I gather, are there any graffiti that are made with other media that play into this?
Scribes, markers, mean streets, dust tags. Yeah.
Yes, and do you take those into account also?
Oh yeah, of course.
And do the same symbols appear in the different media?
Completely.
So then, point two is actually half of this is just a written language. You might call it hidden writing. some of it is rather cryptic, but it's easily read once you figure out the system. It's linguistic. It's written left to right, it's words we can understand, but some, like Trucha, some is a code which mixes the Roman numerals and Arabic numerals, or rebus-type machines, or the signs, the symbols. The arrow pointing to territory is a sema. Baser is a text. And there's a fundamental difference there. So actually, I would argue that what we've been looking at here is another one of these text and semata combinations. And in fact, they're often written together, not just as rebuses, but I'm not sure what this squiggle arrow means, but that is a non-linguistic marker of some kind. Whereas was here and much of the rest is really text. It may be serving a similar function in as you say, Kilroy was here, or I was here, simply to say baser, and that's my mark. But it's actually an identifier of an identity that indicates who it is. Whereas if this were identifying an individual, it would be a code known only to the inner circle of the code. And many of the systems we've been looking at earlier, this was precisely our problem. We could say there looks like a code going on here, but we don't really understand how it works in many ways.
And also, so you mentioned sort of being respectful of word baser and everything, but I'm wondering, obviously nobody seems to be blatantly ruining somebody else's work, at least in this case, but, and this very interesting use of sort of negative spaces and the way people carve out space for themselves, but in terms of sema, right, this is very polyphonic. They're not conveying single messages, right? They could be potentially extremely discordant, right? You could have two gangs not writing over each other, but against each other, right?
Oh, it's called topping each other. So you don't so crossing someone out is the ultimate disrespect. But going over someone sometimes just saying you're not significant enough to have beef with, but you're so insignificant that I can go on top of you. In this case, though, these are non-gang graffiti writers, and they're respecting each other's space. In particular, the person who's getting the most respect on this wall is the upper right-hand side, Chaka. He's considered the most prolific graffiti writer ever, especially in Los Angeles, and no one would ever get within a couple of inches of his tag because of his status, not because he's the toughest guy, because he's not because of any other reason other than the respect that he's gained by being a prolific graffiti writer, and also not the respect he's gained by being innovative in terms of lettering, but by so perfectly reproducing simple, legible font, which has gotten him a new kind of respect that Cray 1 on the left-hand side can't get no matter how innovative he will ever be.
Jeff, I think you had a point you were going to make as well.
Just to pick up actually on your point that it struck me that almost all the examples, with I think the exception of Genevieve's paper and Howard's paper, assume the semasiographic systems that are talking about are deeply embedded in linguistic systems of writing, deeply embedded in writing. And I think almost every other cultural example that we've looked at. But those two seem like the potential outliers where the people who are engaging in this kind of mark making aren't necessarily simultaneously engaging in linguistic mark making, or at least we're not sure. And so I guess that would be an open question: is to what extent do you need to have linguistic systems of mark making to begin to talk about non-linguistic systems of mark making? Does that dialectic have to be? I mean, of course, it's at a basic level,
Yes.
right? Dialectic, it has to be there, but I'm just sort of curious if that's something that we should parse.
One of the possible answers would perhaps be that writing, whatever present, imposes itself as a highly successful system. And it would seem to me, at least, when studying my own material, when reading theoretical literature, that writing is inescapable. As soon as it is there, you have to use it to any extent possible. And maybe, now I'm theoretically freewheeling, is that writing is so successful because it is a system that is optimal to the need of the human brain to read and to decipher, to see structure and to see sequence. And I think there are very few systems, even the more complicated marking systems, that meet that particular cognitive requirement. It's the need of us to see structure. It's what makes us see faces in shrubs and in clouds, and so on. And writing is highly successful at that. So whatever it is, it offers itself, it imposes itself. to be used. Because, and when it's not there, I mean, it's not there. As Elkin said, so you can have the other two components, the picture and the annotation, would make up what he says semasiography. And you would have to do with these two components only, but as soon as writing shows up in any context, it gets a grip on the brain.
So I guess it's a grandiose proposition is that can we add making symbolic art as another trait of human beings in addition to language? I guess it's a question for the anthropologists. Do we know if there's any
Yeah. No, I was
animals
gonna
making
just respond to that. Well, I think the big thing is that, I mean, it's one of the really fun things about working in the Paleolithic is our world now is so graphically based. It's actually hard to imagine a time that once upon a time, there was no graphic marks. Our ancestors did not know how to do it. They were completely bound by verbal communication. And it's actually hard to wrap your head around because it's hard to even imagine a world where we don't make little mark, like that we don't make some sort of mark. And so it's why it's such a fascinating time period to study, is that I'm actually getting to look at the very first time that these ancestors who were fully modern humans, like they had the capacity, the very first time that they actually came up with the idea of doing it. Which is, I think, what gets so interesting is that, of course, writing is so much more complex that there's going to be a lot of things are going to happen before you potentially get to a point where it might even be something useful to, sort of grow and propagate and have people who are specialists who can do this. But it's very interesting to see it's that question, what do you have if you don't have writing? And what do those very first graphic attempts look like? Is basically what I have the pleasure of actually looking at. So it's a very interesting question. It's actually hard to get your mind around though, because it is hard to divorce graphic, our reality of being so graphically based. Yeah.
Genevieve, I wanted to follow up with something you said right at the start, when you said before there was a period, of course, when our ancestors had no symbolic communication or mark making, but they were verbal. Do you imagine that spoken language, words actually, that there existed language before any mark making was discovered?
Absolutely.
I disagree. But what is your evidence that the Paleolithic people were using words?
I would say based on the positioning of the hyoid bone in the throat, combined with when you take a skull, the inside of the skull, you can actually do what's called an endocast, and you can actually get a sense of the impression of the shape of the brain. And by the time we're talking about modern humans for sure, Broca's area, Wernicke's, like all of those are completely developed. We can see the same bulges that exist now. So, I mean, in that sense, I think that
the capacity to be able, I mean, the minor bird can speak, but not until it's taught.
Yeah, but I think also what we're looking at too is we're looking at quite complex behaviors, or even things like trying to heat treat ochre, say, 160,000 years ago. In order to heat treat ochre, you have to heat it to a very specific temperature range. And to do that, you actually have to create a covered, like it's very complex. To do that without language would have been very difficult. And I think, again, with the complexity of the tools we're seeing by modern humans as well, toolmaking probably played actually a lot into creating a lot of these skills, a lot of these capacities in the brain, because toolmaking does require pre-planning, it requires abstract thought. And by the complexity of modern human tools, they're doing things that, again, you might be able to do it just by watching somebody who's sort of grunting at you and using a few sounds. But it would be a heck of a lot easier to pass these skills on.
Show, don't tell.
If you could actually use words to do it.
What maybe we're getting the slippery slope here of what speaking means and what language means itself. I mean, aren't there cetaceans? Isn't it understood that they have
some kind of coded sonar coding?
It has vocabulary and everything.
It's not
It's
verbal.
genetically
It's
too,
not
though.
verbal.
Not verbal.
But they're underwater.
It's acoustic
Yeah.
and oral, but not verbal.
No, what's actually really interesting though is the FOXP2 gene. So from a genetic point of view, humans also have the capacity genetically to talk. So
And we have the capacity probably to make up our mind to conclude our discussions for this afternoon, because I'm mindful of the gentlemen in back who need to wrap up very, very soon. We only have a minute left in the allotted time. But John and I thank you very much for coming. We particularly thank the speakers for doing such a fine job and for putting such equity sweat equity, is that the expression, into their talks and into their good thinking and comments. So we will adjourn now, and I think the plan is that for many of you, if you want, you would go to your hotels, and then we would meet you there. Speakers, yeah, and moderators, and that we would meet them at
20, let's say 20 to 8 perhaps at your hotel,
mhm.
because we're going to walk from your place to the restaurant. You're welcome to find it on your own, and if you will make it on your own, we can tell you where we're going. Steve has been there, I have not, so he would be the better person to ask.
And I believe it's on information that Mallory has circulated as well. Okay, thank you very much.